Welcome to Advertising and Media Communications with the University of Phoenix. Over the next 5 weeks, we're going to cover a wide range of topics, first starting with the overview of media communications, and then moving into specific components of media communications, specifically news and advertising. Next, we have media campaigns, followed by media technologies, and then we're going to end the course with the future of advertising and media communications. But this first week, let's talk about an overview of media communications. We have three specific objectives that we want to accomplish this week. First, of course, we need to define media communications. Then we need to be able to explain the impact of significant milestones in media communications. And then finally, we need to compare and contrast the types and functions of media communications. The first thing we need to talk about is a definition of advertising and media communications. Now, advertising is pretty easy to define in your contemporary advertising text. If you look in the glossary, they have a nice definition of advertising, which in a nutshell says that it's a specific activity that's generally paid for to communicate information about goods and services to an audience. Media communications, on the other hand, is a little more difficult to define, as I'm sure you figured out with our discussion question this week. There's not a specific definition that I was able to find anyway in our text or just generally on the internet. But in looking at different things, I've come up with what I feel like is a pretty decent definition. And really, media communications is using the media to communicate information about goods and services or a company. Really, it's a function of public relations. You could argue that advertising is a specific type of media communication where, generally speaking, media communications is unpaid. Advertising is, of course, paid. So that is one potential definition of media communications, but I'm sure that if you were to ask a dozen people, half would agree with that and the other half wouldn't. So just work up your own definition and be sure to explore that in the discussion questions. Now, there are lots of major milestones in advertising and media communications. For right now, let's just look at three. One is the Fairness Doctrine, and that one's been in the news really over the last probably 6 to 8 months. And the idea there is that for a topic that is controversial or has two sides, that the media is required to present both sides of an argument. Now, in 1987, that law was done away with. Originally, the FCC was required to take control of the Fairness Doctrine, but they got rid of that in 1987. And there has been some talk about reestablishing it, but that really hasn't happened. And I think the reason that will continue to be the case, that it won't happen, is because really there are so many different outlets for people to get their ideas across that I don't think that the Fairness Doctrine is as necessary as it was when we only had 2 or 3 channels on TV, and we had only one major newspaper in a market. We had a couple radio stations. Obviously, that's not the case. We have the internet and 200 television channels. Satellite radio brings us a few hundred channels. And of course, you can get news from around the world instead of buying the newspaper. So that's one milestone. Another one is the Telecommunications Act of 1996, and really this is important because it changed the entire playing field for telecommunications. And the last Telecommunications Act was written in the 30s, so it's important because they really did bring that up to date. Now, 96 was just the very beginning of the World Wide Web, so I imagine that we'll have some other acts that will help broaden the Telecommunications Act, because a lot of the issues that we're dealing with now deal with the internet and the World Wide Web, and so I think that will continue to evolve. Now, finally, the last major milestone I want to talk about is the fair use doctrine, and that's around copyrighted material. And actually, you all have participated in that. And really, that's saying that you don't have to get permission of a publisher or an author every time you use bits and pieces of their articles or books for scholarly purposes. So, whenever you quote someone in your papers that you turn in, that's part of the fair use doctrine. Now, there are obviously lots of different types of media, and they have a lot of different functions. This is just a short list that you can review here now. And they all serve a purpose to inform us and entertain us in our daily lives. Now, media has changed a lot in recent years because of something called a conglomerate. A conglomerate is basically a company that has a lot of different divisions that are seemingly unrelated divisions. Now, where this is important is in the mass media, in news, for example. There are companies that own news channels, but they also own divisions that um, sell products. And so, as you might guess, there are um, the potential for bias in that case, where a company that sells a product that has suddenly become news, that makes it challenging for the news channel to cover its own product, so to speak. So that has been a real issue of late. And of course, there are conglomerates that not only hold different products and news channels, but they own a lot of different types of news media. Clear Channel, for example, has radio stations, television stations, and even billboards in some markets. So that's one example. Now, media theory models, you'll want to look in your dynamics text to look at the different types of media communications models. The traditional mass communications model is really kind of the idea of one to many, where you have a message from one, say a company or a person, and it's distributed to many. The internet is a lot different because we have more one-to-one communications. We also have the gatekeepers are different in a traditional mass communications model. To have something on television, for example, you had to go through many gatekeepers just to have it on TV. The internet isn't the same way. If you have an email address or if you have some internet hosting space, you can really carry your message out to the entire world without any types of gatekeepers. Now, obviously, management is important in the functions of mass communications and media communications. When we talk about the organizational chart, that's really where advertisers and public relations professionals fit into that organizational chart. In some cases, those professionals are on the same level with the president in that they communicate directly with the president, and so they are a big part of the policy making of a company. In other cases, however, public relations and advertising are a distant function from the area of management, and so really they aren't used for setting policy, but rather communicating it. Uh, Obviously, mergers have changed the way that companies communicate and the way that management functions. For a company to grow, in a lot of cases, that's done through merger and acquisition, which is a big switch from a few years ago. Well, when I say a few, maybe 20 years ago, when the best way to grow was really to just grow the business. So that is how the function of management has changed and how it relates to us as communicators. Now that's the end of our first week. If you have any questions, of course, please feel free to post them in the threads, and look forward to talking to you again in week 2.